So as the global atmospheric temperature warms, we are going to have to be prepared for wildfire risk in places that we historically didn't really have to think much about wildfire risk. So the map that we're looking at here is the change in wildfire danger days. So wildfire danger days would be days where the conditions would be more susceptible to wildfire if it were to ignite. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee that those days will have wildfire, but if a fire were to ignite through human activity like a campfire or cigarette, or through something like lightning, the conditions would make that area more susceptible for a wildfire to spread. So we can see here at 1 degree of warming, we see some places that are showing up in that yellow color along the eastern seaboard and kind of the Appalachian Mountains there. That color represents something from a week to something like 2 weeks of additional wildfire danger days. At 1.5 degrees of warming, you see those colors expand significantly to other parts of the country. And at 2, 2.5, and 3, we see that color expand and get deeper into those oranges and those reds pretty much everywhere in the US. And the reason for that is because vegetation is staying in the same place while the climate is changing. So at 3 degrees of warming, essentially all of the trees and all of the plants are just in the wrong climate. There's a new climate there that the vegetation, that the trees, that the plants were not necessarily evolved for.
Welcome to the All Things Wildfire podcast, where we delve into the latest trends and hot topics in protecting properties against wildfire. So sit back, relax, and join us as we arm you against disaster.
Boom. Hey, thank you everyone for joining us for another podcast of the All Things Wildfire podcast. And today's guest is Alison Smart. And what's really interesting, Alison, is that, we talked earlier, and you're not necessarily, one of these people that talk about climate change, but you're actually specifically talking about climate literacy, which I think is really unique from the standpoint of having us better understand what's happening with the climate versus all this talk about climate change, what's happening, but really more of an education for us laymen that are just keep hearing this term of climate change over the last 5-10 years. So Alison, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. You are the Executive Director of Probable Futures, and I'll let you unpack that a little bit and let our guests know what you do.
Yeah, so Probable Futures is a climate literacy initiative, and we started it in part because we recognize that people know a lot of things about climate change, or they associate a lot of things about climate change. I mean, they hear a lot of things in the news, and I think if you say climate change to the average person, it draws up imagery of solar panels and electric cars and Elon Musk and Al Gore and polar bears and ice caps and all of these things. It's like this constellation of things, but they're not necessarily a cohesive understanding of our physical climate, how that physical climate is changing, why those changes matter, and how those specific changes in the climate, in the weather, are likely to intersect with the things that we care about, whether those things are things in our personal life or things that intersect with business or industry at a high level. So Probable Futures is a climate literacy initiative. What we do is we make climate science accessible and understandable so that everyone everywhere can really think about climate change in practical ways and actually prepare for the level of warming that we're living with today and the conditions that we're living with today that we haven't done much to prepare for, and the conditions that we're likely to live with in the future.
Excuse me. You know what's interesting is I met you at the Risk Resilience Symposium that was given by Marsh. And just recently, you mentioned that for thousands of years, there really hasn't been a need for climate literacy, right? Because our world and our planet hasn't changed much. But now things seem to be progressing fairly quickly. And I think this is, this is your life's work. And I feel like it's coming to some sort of a peak where now people are listening to you probably more, right? What can you speak about with regards to, for so many years there was no need, and now we have this rush of things that are taking place?
Yeah. So Probable Futures is still a fairly new initiative. So we launched around 6 years ago. So we, launched during a time when we were already starting to see these changes and really had a need for understanding what they were and what we should expect. So I and my colleague that I spoke with were brought to that symposium to help that audience build their climate literacy again, because it was not necessarily something that was needed in the past. The entire insurance industry actually developed in a stable climate, and I can share a little bit more about what I said there. I think it could be helpful
Sure.
to your audience. So let me just share my screen here, because I think it can kind of set the context and help people understand how wildfire specifically is changing. So this conference where we met, this was in LA, and we started out by saying, there are a lot of places where we walk into and we have to kind of help people into the idea that the climate is already changing. That is clearly not the case in LA. Obviously, we were there just a few months after those extreme and deadly wildfires happened. So it was the case that specifically this audience is connected to the insurance sector. In this place, like, they had all seen climate risk materialize. They already had in their imaginations what that can look like. And so, we talk a lot about climate risk with very different audiences, and we often get these questions like, oh, you work on climate change. Where should I move to that will be, climatically safe? Or what should I buy or sell? What are the opportunities, or what are the investments that I should get rid of? And very practically, will I be able to get insurance in a changing climate? And these questions are all really understandable and are really practical, but we really hear them as cries to understand this question. How do we live in a changing climate? So that is what Probable Futures is here to help people explore, is how can we make sure that communities and industries and businesses and families can thrive while managing climate impacts, the climate impacts that we can't avoid, and work to avoid the impacts that would be really unmanageable. And so this might seem like a really big picture, like an amorphous question, but we see climate literacy as a really fundamental solution to that question of how do we live well in a changing climate. And the fact is that everyone needs climate literacy. Because we are living a changing climate today, it is a 21st century skill, in the same way that financial literacy or digital literacy is essential to living in the modern world today. Well, now climate literacy is too. And the reason for that is because for a long time, we didn't need climate literacy. We could just expect that the past would give us the patterns, the climatic patterns that would continue in the future. And we made those assumptions for good reason. And the reason was because for 12,000 years, the climate of the past could inform the future. So actually, climate science helps us understand why it was the case that the climate was so stable that we really didn't need to pay attention to it very much. So this graph that I'm showing here is a graph of the global temperature history of the Earth. And this graph starts starts at the dawn of civilization, so around 12,000 years ago. And the way that this graph works is that it's measuring the global average temperature for each of these 12,000 years and then comparing it to the late 19th century. So the way to understand this graph is that two things. The straighter the line is, the more stable the global average temperature, and by extension, the more stable the climate was. And number two, the closer that the data point is to zero, the more similar the climate was to the climate that we're kind of used to in the past. And so for 12,000 years, the climate barely even fluctuated a degree. Right. It always stayed the same. And what that meant was that the patterns of temperature stayed the same in every place, and the patterns of precipitation stayed the same in every place. And what that meant was that we could settle, we could practice agriculture. So what that meant, that stable climate allowed us to settle. It allowed us to practice agriculture. It allowed us to have long-term communities, and those communities eventually formed their own cultures. Those cultures eventually formalized into governments, which built infrastructure, anything from roads and bridges to laws and policies that figuratively and literally paved the way for the economy, until we had all kinds of specializations in this very complex, very sophisticated civilization that we see today. So really, all of civilization was built on a foundation of climate stability. When that we could expect the climate to stay the same in every particular place, we could do things like this. We could start to grow olive groves in Greece, and then 7,000 years later, still be growing olives in the same exact places around the world, except now we're doing it at a scale where where 20% of the arable land in Greece is for growing olives, and we ship it all around the world. And people who don't live in olive growing regions like me, use it every single day. So why is this relevant now? How does this relate to climate stability or climate literacy? Well, it's because that stability is over. And so we know that the climate is now warming. We have actually already broken out of that civilization temperature band. And if we continue on the same trajectory, we'll be breaking out of the band of global average temperatures that humans have ever lived with. And the interesting thing is, we haven't always had civilization before. So humans have been around for 200,000 years, but for the first 190,000 years of our existence, we were a nomadic hunting and gathering species. Well, why was that the case? We now know why, because the climate was changing dramatically in those 190,000 years, and it was only that stable climate that really allowed us to have that complex, settled civilization that we built over time. So what we need to understand is how much climate stability can our civilization, how much climate instability can our civilization really absorb, and how can we prepare all of these things that we built on top of that stable climate to make sure that it can withstand more climate instability. But then also, how do we make sure that we avoid outcomes that would be really extreme and that would be very difficult to adapt to? So that was the kind of thing that we were talking about, just helping people understand that the climate is changing, which many of us see, and the fact that a stable climate really underpins everything that we built in civilization.
Wow, those are some very powerful slides, and thank you for the education there, because it really does also lend itself to understand, the stability that's been taking place for thousands of years, and now the year after year after year, the instability that takes place, which is, for our listeners, we're dealing with insurance and wildfire and all these things. And so it makes sense that the insurance companies are super unstable, trying to understand what the heck is going on. How much more frequent are these wildfires going to take place? We've got just around the world, we've got wildfires everywhere that never you would never heard of. And so it makes a lot of sense the way that you described it. So thank you for sharing that, because I think it really helps us realize that we're really tied together, regardless of what's taking place in different parts of the world. Everything really ties together because it creates either stability or instability in a lot of things that we rely on now. Mm-hmm. So I love that. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, what the other thing that we do or one of the other things that we do besides just helping people understand, like have that context for, okay, climate change is about the fact that we have never maintained civilization in a changing climate before. That's totally unprecedented. Okay, well, now what do we do? Well, it turns out we have really good information that can help us understand how these conditions are going to change. So how, wildfire risk is going to change and where it will change, how heat risk is going to change and where it will change. And so we at Probable Futures make available climate model data that is near global in its scope, but able to scale down to a local level to help people understand in specific places how have the conditions changed here and how are they likely to change in the future, because that is really a gift, this information about the future that, we really understand, what these climate models help us understand how these things will change. And I'm happy to share some of those maps with your audience. And
please do.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's go back to the idea of California here. So this is just an image of Southern California. And what I think is really interesting about this image to begin with is it really highlights the assumptions that we have made. So the thing about that we had climate stability for so long, we built everything in our civilization assuming that climate stability would continue. So we put those olive orchards in those places and said, we believe that the climate is going to be similar enough in this place that we're going to invest and put these olive trees here. And in a place like California, just looking at it really shows the assumptions that are being made here. There's a 4-lane highway right next to the ocean. So what this is showing here is when we built this 4-lane highway, we said, we expect that ocean to stay right there. We don't think it's going to move. And that wasn't a bad call necessarily, because for 12,000 years, the ocean really hadn't moved. You could, expect it to stay right there. We have all those homes built on the side of that mountain there. So, okay, well, we expected that it was going to be safe among all of that vegetation. So every single place has been built around the climate of its past, and every single place now is changing. So like I said, Probable Futures maps and data can help us understand the ways in which those places are changing. So I pulled up a map here. You can find these on probablefutures.org. The map that we're looking at is the number of days above 90 degrees in Los Angeles. And so all of our maps are organized around these warming scenarios here. So a half a degree of warming represents the time period of 1971 to 2000. So we use this as kind of like a proxy to understand, well, what were the conditions of that stable climate in this place? What were the conditions that Los Angeles was built around? Yeah. And so Los Angeles in a stable climate could expect something like 68 days a year to be above 90 degrees. Now, not every year is exactly the same, right? But the important thing to understand is that the range of possibilities of what weather Los Angeles might experience was fixed. And so in a cooler year, it might only be about 6 days above 90. In a warmer year, it might be, something like half the year. But now that's changing. So at 1 degree of warming, you can see how those numbers increase. 1.5 degrees is closest to where we are now. So now in that average year, it's something like 3 months above 90. In a cooler year, now it's going to be like 2 weeks, and in a warmer year, several months. So
Wow.
these are the conditions that we really need to be prepared for now. And then 2 degrees, we are likely to hit 2 degrees sometime in the next few decades. So we need to make sure that our infrastructure is prepared for that. And then we also see that there will be changes in precipitation. So one of the things that I talked to the audience about there was the fact that heat is drying out the vegetation that's in Los Angeles. But even actually, sometimes there's increased precipitation because of climate change. So this map here is showing the change in precipitation of the 1 in 100 year storm. So it's really just a big rare storm in LA, a storm that in a stable climate had something like a 1% chance of happening. And at 2 degrees of warming, that storm is going to have an additional 34 millimeters of precipitation in it. So the reason that that is the case, that heat is increasing and also precipitation is increasing, but also that we are seeing more dryness and more drought, is because warmer air holds more moisture. So for every 1 degree warmer the air is, it can hold 7% more water vapor. And what that ends up looking like is that the warmer air can draw more moisture from the land through evaporation. It can hold that moisture up there for longer. And then when it does come down, it can come down in greater quantities than it has in the past. So we're going to see these swings in between deluges and dry periods. And so these are the conditions that really preceded the Los Angeles wildfires, was that there were a couple of years where there was an unusual amount of precipitation in LA. And what happened in those years was that a lot more vegetation grew. Then
Right.
we had a year that was particularly dry and hot. And so all that vegetation dried out, and then there was much more fuel that was available for the Santa Ana winds when they came through. So this is how the particular climate is changing in LA. In other places, it's changing in different ways, but our maps and our data can show the nature of that change. And a lot of what we do is going to these places or talking to different industries about how these changes are intersecting and creating more risk in their communities.
Wow. That's a great explanation. Part of the work that we do is we spray fire retardant on hillsides for homeowners and business owners. Specifically, when we have heat advisories, or we have potential high winds. And I know every state is a little bit different, and they may or may not have high winds, but that really is one of the biggest issues that we have. Excuse me. And over the years, it's so interesting because vegetation management is super important, right? To be able to trim the trees or the bushes or whatever we have there. But we've been seeing like the growth does not stop. And this slide and what you just explained really helps us understand that, wow, even though it's been warm in the past months or the past years, these plants have grown, multiplied, gotten larger, and every year we go out there, it's like, holy smokes, let's talk to the gardener again because something either they're not trimming enough or these things are growing super quickly. And so, what a great explanation to be able to understand scientifically what's taking place with vegetation and the importance of being able to always keep an eye on our vegetation to manage it properly. So,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, happy to. And I mean, I think it's also worth noting, and we talk a lot about how climate risk is really it's the intersection of exposure to climate hazards by your vulnerability. So Los Angeles has high exposure to climate risk, right? Their vulnerability is actually pretty. It is not high. Their vulnerability is actually pretty low, especially compared to other places, because Los Angeles has a whole infrastructure to manage wildfire. There's a lot of knowledge, and people, have just culturally an awareness that this is something that happens here, and this is something that we need to be prepared for. In many cases, there is insurance. Now, obviously, that's starting to become a problem as these climate changes are happening. But there's also, there is money there's an expectation that these things are going to happen. Now, what is concerning about wildfire risk is that it's showing up in a lot of places that don't have that history of actually dealing with wildfire risk. And so we're going to start to see a lot more wildfire in places that we historically never saw them and didn't expect to see them. So as the global atmospheric temperature warms, we are going to have to be prepared for wildfire risk in places that we historically didn't really have to think much about wildfire risk. So the map that we're looking at here is the change in wildfire danger days. So wildfire danger days would be days where the conditions would be more susceptible to wildfire if it were to ignite. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee that those days will have wildfire, but if a fire were to ignite through human activity like a campfire or cigarette, or through something like lightning, the conditions would make that area more susceptible for a wildfire to spread. So we can see here at 1 degree of warming, we see some places that are showing up in that yellow color along the eastern seaboard and kind of the Appalachian Mountains there. That color represents something from a week to something like 2 weeks of additional wildfire danger days. At 1.5 degrees of warming, you see those colors expand significantly to other parts of the country. And at 2, 2.5, and 3, we see that color expand and get deeper into those oranges and those reds pretty much everywhere in the US. And the reason for that is because vegetation is staying in the same place while the climate is changing. So at 3 degrees of warming, essentially all of the trees and all of the plants are just in the wrong climate. There's a new climate there that the vegetation, that the trees, that the plants were not necessarily evolved for.
Wow. Allison, I'm as I'm listening, I'm thinking underwriters are going to want to talk to you. They really should want to talk to you just from the standpoint of probability and what's changed in the last 20 years, what's changed in the last 10 years, to really have a better understanding of their potential exposure. So interesting. And I want to make sure before we finish, Allison, and I don't want to forget about this, just to leave your email address in case some of our insurance brokers, insurance experts want to share your information with others to be able to contact you to have a better understanding and a grip as to what's taking place. Because the slides you just showed right now are kind of intimidating, from the standpoint of really what the potential is. So let me ask you. So in the sliding scale, when you talk and you show that 0.05, there's it turns out to be this. When you do 1% more, it turns out to be this, and then 2%. Where do we stand now, and how fast do you see these swings taking place in these changes to really kind of anticipate? Is it 5 years from now that it's going to probably get to this place? 10 years from now, get to that place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do have a graphic for that. So you were saying 1%, 2%. So the way that we want to think about it, and the way that we do think about it in the science community, is levels of warming. Okay, so it's not percentage necessarily. It is thinking about what level of warming are we at today. What level of warming was this industry, let's say the insurance industry, what level of warming was that industry built for, and what level of warming are we likely to see in the future? So we put this graphic together. So, this corresponds to our map. So 0.5 degree of warming, that was, like I said, the time period between 1971 to 2000, that was still kind of like a stable climate. And this time period was the time period that a lot of building codes were developed, that engineering standards were developed, that some insurance markets or catastrophe bonds developed. So basically everything in our world was built around the conditions of the past. City storm sewers were built for a certain amount of precipitation that is specific to that place. And when engineers went to figure out, well, what should that capacity be, they looked to the past and they said, okay, well, let's look at the past 100 years, see what the precipitation levels were, and we'll build for that. So our world is built for, this level of warming and the conditions that come with this level of warming. We passed 1 degree of warming around 10 to 15 years ago. So we have already been living with the conditions of a changed climate, but so far, an incrementally changed climate, and we're closest to 1.5 degrees today. So now if you think back to those maps that I showed you and see where 2, 2.5, and 3 show up, we don't know exactly when each one of these warming scenarios will happen. And it's not the case where like one day you wake up and you're at 2 degrees of warming when yesterday you were at 1.5 degrees of warming. All of this is gradual, but you will notice on this graphic that, these seem, fairly far apart. There's about 25 years here, and then they start to get closer together. So 1.5 degrees of warming now. We don't know exactly when 2 degrees will happen, but if we continue on the same emissions trajectory, so if we don't, deploy more renewable energy and other kinds of solutions to emissions, if we continue on that same trajectory, we could be hitting 2 degrees, something like, some of the models say as early as 2030. Now that's a very low probability, but it is showing in the models, or it could be something like 2040 or so here, that's why we have this kind of like faded color here, because we don't know exactly when it'll happen, but we do have a pretty good sense of it. But the warmer the atmosphere gets, the faster it will warm. And the reason for that is because there are things that actually create more warming. So for example, like forests drying out and releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. So there are these things in the Earth system that can accelerate warming over time. And that's why when you hear about in the news that we're trying so hard to keep warming under two degrees under the global average temperature of 2 degrees. That's why, because over 2 degrees of warming, things start to get really uncertain. We don't know exactly how much warming might go into the system. We don't know exactly how fast that could all move. But we do know that if we continue on the same emissions trajectory as today, if we don't radically change things, a 10-year-old child today would be living in a 3-degree world. And so we really do have a window of time here where we have to do two things. We have to prepare for the conditions that we know that we will live with, but we also have to work really hard to avoid those higher levels of warming, because those higher levels of warming bring with it a lot of risk, and we don't know exactly. I can show you more maps of what that risk looks like physically, what drought risk looks like physically, but we don't know exactly how that's going to intersect with our civilization. We don't know how it might spur human migration. We don't know exactly how it will affect agriculture. And so that's why we talk so much about climate risk, because it is about risk thinking and about thinking, okay, well, what are the highly likely scenarios? What are the maybe lower probability scenarios, but the scenarios that would be so bad that we really want to avoid those scenarios altogether?
Wow. Allison, you were like the bearer of bad news, my dear. I mean, I thank you for sharing all this, but it's interesting because the question I have right now is one of the slides you showed early on, which is, where do I move? Like, where do we go? What do we do, right? So, like, okay, so do we have to live in concrete jungles, right? Do we have to get rid of all of our vegetation? And look, I'll say this, and these are just, I'm asking just kind of like almost rhetorical questions, but I know that our industry, wildfire prevention, is really moving into a place where lawmakers are making some really good strides in being able to clear the 5-foot radius around the perimeter of a property. Mm-hmm. Super smart, very intelligent, so that way we have less combustible materials that are near their home that will that cannot ignite, and they won't produce enough heat to break windows and ignite the property. So I love that, but it sounds like still even beyond that, what you're describing is this wave. It is the way I see it. This wave of more probabilities in a negative way that we have to move faster to be able to, like you said, be prepared for what is inevitably coming. Whether, like you said, it's 2030 or 2050. That's still a pretty small gap, in my opinion, right? Like in our lifetime, we're going to see it. We're going to see the 1.5 degree move to 2. Like that's kind of scary when you think about it, on how vulnerable in the maps that you're showing, just the United States, right? How the vulnerabilities of what we're going to be facing there, and I think it's really going to change the dynamics of how we as a society begin to live within these risks that are going to be coming our way more prominently and more top of mind for us to deal with, that we can no longer avoid.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I appreciate that I could be seen as the bearer of bad news. I think, the way that we think about it and the way that a lot of the audiences receive this is as like, well, thank God I know now. It's a very different thing to know that climate change is going to be a big deal and it's just scary. And it's like, you don't exactly know what to do with that. It's anxiety, it hangs over your head, but it's not specific. What is specific is LA will have these specific changes in this way, and these are the scenarios that we want to avoid entirely. We have the tools and the systems that we need to prepare for those changes and to avoid the worst scenarios. I would rather tackle that being completely informed than living my life not knowing that that risk is out there, because that is going to make us so much more vulnerable. So we believe, and it's true really, that preparation is an act of hope. It is a way of saying we are planning for the future. We are going to be here in the future. We expect to thrive in the future. And so we're going to make sure that we are prepared for these conditions. And I would like to leave with what I think is a really I think with what is a really inspiring story that relates to the insurance industry and that relates to fire specifically. But this is an image of the Great Chicago Fire, which a lot of cities started burning, having massive citywide fires on a regular basis because there were all kinds of risks. There were all kinds of exposure to different ignition sources within the city, but then the buildings were not equipped, were not ready for those conditions. And so after this big fire, and there's one in any major, one or more in history in pretty much any major city in the US that you go to, and in abroad as well, depending on the place. But after this, governments and insurers got together and they said, this can't happen anymore. I mean, the insurance industry could not continue to insure all of these buildings and all of these places and operate, and be commercially viable. So what happened is they got together and the insurers said, government, you need to create building codes, you need to create municipal fire departments, you need to, build the infrastructure and the systems that would make it viable for us to be able to actually offer insurance. And so that's what ended up happening. And so together, the private sector and the public sector kind of work together to de-risk society, to de-risk from this particular kind of risk. And so now we're seeing a new risk come along. And so we are going to need the same thing. We are going to need, but the only difference is now we live in an even more complex society, even more so than in 1851. We've got, the insurance markets are incredibly complex with catastrophe bonds and reinsurance and, and also just the market. So, we need different parts of society to come together and to say, how do we reduce risk? And that's going to be best for insurers. That's one of the reasons that we like to speak with audiences who are in the insurance sector, and because we're really aligned in that insurers want, less risk within society, especially with, property casualty, so that they can offer products. And that, as a nonprofit, what we're after as well is being prepared and de-risking society as much as we can to prepare for these changes that we know are coming, and that we have really good information, like the information on probablefutures.org, that can help us prepare for it.
Boom. Alison, thank you so much. That is very powerful, and you're right, inspiring from the standpoint of we're in a very similar situation, right, from the Chicago fires and what's taking place back in the past. And there are government agencies, there are communities coming together, private companies jumping in to make sure, like, what can we do to help? And so I think the collaboration of that, and I really love your message of, preparation really equals hope, right? The hope for us to say, hey, we understand what's coming. We are doing the best we can. We're making investments in our preparation because we will learn to live in this type of society that's evolving and changing, and it just causes us to evolve and change also, so we can begin to understand how to live within that type of environment. So, Alison, thank you. Good.
Just one last thing
Yeah.
to say. I know I showed that image of, 10-year-old child living in a 3-degree world. So I have a 10-year-old child, so that I want my 10-year-old and my 13-year-old and everyone else's kids too to know that I knew this was coming. I can't say that I didn't know. We had this information. We have really good science about what would be coming, and that I worked as hard as I could to avoid that future for them and to prepare for them for the futures that we know, or the conditions that we know that we'll live with. So I think that's a really great way of thinking about it. And I would encourage all of your listeners to think about it in that way too. Everybody, this helping to create probable futures and run probable futures was what was in my capacity to do. It was what I had the skills and the education and the experience for, but everyone has a different sphere of influence. Everyone has different things that they can bring to bear. This is a system-wide, society-wide problem. So there is no person that does not have some sphere of influence where they can help prepare for climate impacts or avoid the worst scenarios.
Boom. Amen. You are an evangelist, is what I say. So I think that's beautiful. Honestly, very well said. And I think when you put the perspective in there about our 10-year-old children, or in my case, grandchildren, it's a responsibility. It's a responsibility that we have to those children to make sure that, hey, you know what? We're not going to just live selfishly and ignore what's happening. We're going to make this a better future for you, and we're going to, as a society, prepare. And I love your ability to also state that we that have voices should be using our voices for good and really collaborate with each other to share our level of expertise, whatever that is, to contribute to make this for us to continue to de-risk what's coming in our future. So, Alison, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know our listeners have too. And so you mentioned your website earlier. Can you repeat the website? And then if you don't mind sharing your email address for those that really want to discuss
Sure.
this a little further.
Yeah, the website is probablefutures.org. And probably the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. So just go Alison Smart, Probable Futures on LinkedIn, and just feel free to connect with me, send me a message. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Fantastic. Alison, well, thank you again so much. Thank you for your contribution to what you're doing for all of us. And we'll make sure to continue our collaboration among each other to see what we can do to make some really powerful things happen.
Okay.
So,
Well, thanks for your work too, and thanks so much for having me.
thank you, Alison.
Be sure to subscribe to our show and follow us on social media to stay up to date on all things wildfire. And as always, thanks for listening.